Mhm. All right, good afternoon, everyone. It is about an hour later than we normally get going, and that's not because I started late, but what I did was I went back and from Hot 1, I went back and redid the distance converter program, but I did it using a second route. All right, please watch that video because you have another assignment that's going to be due Sunday, and that is to redo hot number 1 and follow the instructions as far as creating an additional controller and an additional model, etc. And if you say I already did that, just please watch the video. And if you think you did it, just send me an email and say it's already done. Otherwise, go back and redo it accordingly. Now, I'm going to go over all this, but before we do, I want to very quickly show you this is what we're doing this week. Not there, not there. There we go. I've just finished redoing hot number 1. All right. I only did problem 1. You have to do problems 1 and 2. All right. Now I'm about to lecture on chapter 6, which is a relatively short chapter. So we'll do that next. All right. Tomorrow, when you come in here, we're going to start at 1:30. An hour and 25 minutes later than normal. And the reason that we are starting later tomorrow is the Rankin Technical College St. Louis Information Technology Job Fair. IT includes the AWD program. Now, I had gotten emails, and I put this on the other tape, but I'm going to say it again. People have asked me, and they've said, what should I do with this if I do want to go to this job fair? First of all, make probably a good dozen copies of your resume, and make sure that on your resume, ideally somewhere near the top, you've got a URL in there that's got the address of where, probably on GitHub Pages, your electronic portfolio is. Make sure that it's up to date. All right. Now, you're online students, so you may or may not have Rankin clothing. All right. If you have no Rankin clothing, I would recommend going there tomorrow with dress pants, dress shoes, darker colored socks, a dress shirt, and maybe even a tie. This is your first chance to make an impression on these people who are going to be at this job fair. All right. So the job fair is, I believe, 9 to noon. If you need more information on it, get a hold of me. If I didn't tell you enough, get a hold of me. All right. Then from 12 until at least 1 tomorrow is our IT advisory board meeting. I'm going to be participating in that, albeit um, remotely. All right. So it's supposed to end by 1, but it might run late. They have in the past. That's why I said we'll start at 1:30. Tomorrow we will build 6.1 and 6.2 that are in your book, and you will be responsible for building those and turning them in. We'll also take a quick look at case study 6.1. That one you're going to do on your own, and it's not really very hard. Wednesday, we're going to go over hot number 2 that you did last week. We're going to go over it as a class. I'm going to write it from the start. All right. Everything. If there's time, and there should be, we'll begin chapter 7. If we finish chapter 7 on Wednesday, great. And if we don't, we'll finish it up on Thursday. Then we will go through project 7.1, build the My Website app as a class. And I'm going to assign to you case study 7.1, which is improve the Razor views. Friday will be our typical lab period with no lecture and no emails. Now, I have graded most everybody's stuff, but I haven't graded everybody's stuff. So I haven't updated the grades. I'm going to try to get that done for you by the time we start class tomorrow. I promise you, I will do my darndest. So with that said, let's go back for just a second into here. So again, today we're going to go over chapter 6. I already again went over. Please watch that tape, the earlier tape. It's a video set. It's about And again, tomorrow we'll go over the chapter 6 projects and I'll talk a little bit about the case study. Again, this says till 2. No, I'm going to start up at 1:30. I don't think I'll need that. I don't think it'll run over an hour, but it might run 15 minutes to a half an hour over. All right. Okay. Your chapter 6, which is what we're going into now, written test, the labs, and the homework will all be due this coming Sunday, the 24th. All right. So I'll leave it at that. Let's start with the chapter. Because I've already got my thing that says I've got a YouTube. Jeff Scott sends you a private video. You should have all gotten this. And there it is. And I try putting the word private on there as well. So I'm going to, this is for the other class. So I'm going to jump into chapter 6 right now. All right, so far we've gone through section 1 of the book. I'm not going to read any of it. You see it all. We've done all that stuff. Now this week, we're going to go into chapter 6 and we'll get into chapter 7. All right, you can probably plan on next week sometime having a test on chapters 6 and 7. You will be upgrading the app that you did for hot number 2. Then we'll probably go into like 8 and 9 and then have another test, and then probably 10, 11, and 12 and another test. We'll just see how it goes, okay? All right, so I'm going to jump, like I said, into chapter 6. We're in section 2 of the book, and I passed that, but when you look, now we're mastering the essential skills. Chapter 6, as it says, shows us how to work with controllers and routing to provide user-friendly URLs that can improve search engine optimization. Chapter 7 will show us how to use razor views. Chapter 8 will show us how to transfer data from controllers to views and back again. Chapter 9 will go over session state and cookies. Chapter 10 will be model binding. Chapter 11 will be validating data that's stored in the model, and chapter 12 will be EF Core. Chapter 13 is an actual working app that they have in there, a bookstore app, and we'll spend a lot of time on that. Okay, so let's jump into this. Now, I have no idea. This may take me a half an hour. This may take me an hour. It may take me longer. I don't think it'll be much more than an hour. All right, so chapter 6, page 203. In chapter 4, we learned how to create an app that uses the default routing that's available from ASP.NET Core MVC. To start, this chapter describes how routing works in more detail. Then it shows how to customize routing. All right, and it summarizes with some best practices. Not a long chapter, approximately 25 or so pages. So we've got how to use the default route, which is what we've been doing all semester. Second is how to create custom routes. Then how to use attribute routing. All right. Best practices for creating URLs. And for the first time, we'll talk a little bit about areas. So that's what we've got to look forward to here in this chapter. All right. So as it says, the chapter begins by showing how to configure and use the default route, which is again what we've been using. When you begin developing an app, it's common to start with this route. Figure 6.1 shows a program.cs that configures the default route. Okay, it says to do that, it uses what's referred to as endpoint routing. Endpoint routing is, as it says, recommended for any new development. Now, what is that? Well, we've already got this line in here, so we don't need to add it. That says we're using MVC, the builder.services, etc. Remember, in here is where we use SQL server and all that other stuff. We've already got this app.use routing. All right. But as of right now, this has been all we've had. These 3 lines here have been all that we've had as far as our routing, because everything has been the default route, meaning that everything we've been doing has been using the home controller. It is defaulted to, and it is defaulted to the index method in there. All right, so again, nothing new. All right, so let's jump back. Prior to ASP.NET 3.0, you had to use add MVC method to add services. You don't anymore. All right. After you add the necessary services, you need to configure the routing. We don't need to do that anymore. We've got that use routing method. All right. So as of now, at least with what we're doing, there's nothing more that we have to do other than at the bottom, we'll be adding a new route in there. So they say here, these are the methods. The add controllers with views, again, basically says that this is an MVC app. And the add MVC adds additional services that are necessary. The methods for configuring the routes are shown there. I don't want to sit and read to you. You can see them. And again, we are going to be adding another route. Also, the default route should always go last. I want to say that again. The default route should always go last. I may not have even done that. All right. But let's see. Let's see if I did or not. This is the program that I just went and ran over. And I want to change it if necessary. All right. I want to change this and redo those if necessary and run it again and make sure I didn't break anything. Yeah, the default, I was always told at least, because that's your default. It should go on the bottom like that. Now, I'm going to save this and run it again. Nothing should change. It should still work. It should still look exactly the same when we run it. Okay. Well, you notice now it goes right to the distance converter. All right, because that was our first route. Actually, there's nothing wrong with it. If I click clear, I still go back to the home. Okay, I kind of like this better anyway. So if I put nothing in there, still works. If I put something out of range in or there, that works. That works. And that works. So everything still works. I didn't break anything. Good. And you see, I put the default last. I think they're going to say that in here, but we'll look to be sure anyway. Okay. So as they mentioned, ASP.NET 0.0 introduced a new approach that's known as endpoint routing. It's considered a best practice. Before you can use it, you need to add the necessary MVC services. Then you need to mark where the routing decisions are made and configure the endpoints accordingly. All right, how the default route works. And right here, okay, this right here maps to this right here. This says for the default route, home controller. This says for the default route, index method. This says for the default route, and with a question mark, it means it's optional, ID. Remember this right here, this port number is going to be arbitrary. So the port number you get probably won't be 7098. And the port number you get will probably be different than the port number I have. All right, so let's jump back. So figure 6.2 begins by showing a URL that has a domain name and 3 segments. Segment 1 is home, segment 2 is index, segment 3 is Joel. As it says, the pattern for the default route specifies how the segments basically map up. And that's what they're saying in here. The home controller is the default first segment. Index is the default for the second segment. And Joel is the default for the third segment, which has been defined as being optional with a question mark. Then they give a table that shows how this works. So let's jump over to the table. This should now all make sense to you. You should be able to look at anything that's in there and know with all three of these, that's going to default to home and index. That is home and index, and that is home and index. That one is going to default to home about. All right. And there's no, probably no ID with it. None of these have IDs with it up till this point. Then we've got product here. All right. Product index, product list with an ID. All right. Product detail with an ID. Now they mention there, it says this table assumes that the list method defines the ID parameter as a string and doesn't provide a default value for this. As a result, if the URL doesn't specify a third segment, it sets it to null. Okay? Pretty much what you'd think, except for the last one, it defaults it to 0, all right, with an int value, and that's all. All right, so the default route maps a request to an action method within a controller and can optimally pass an argument to that method. All three segments are optional. If you want to specify a later segment, you must do the earlier ones. So in other words, if I'm saying, like here with the about, I couldn't just say about. I've got to say home about if that's where it is. It needs to know where that method lives, for lack of better words. All right. How to code a simple controller and its actions. So as it says, the next figure here shows how to code a simple home controller and two of its actions. Okay, it says to start, the class typically inherits from the controller class, and that controller class is why you need the using Microsoft.ASP.NET Core.MVC namespace. All right, it says in this figure, home controller inherits from controller. I've never seen a controller that doesn't inherit from controller. All right. Within the class for a controller, an action method typically returns an object that implements iAction result. Now there's other things that we haven't looked at yet, and I don't know if they show them in this chapter or it's a later one, like content result. All right. It says, yeah, this chapter shows you how to use the content method to return this. Basically, what they're saying is you can return plain text. I don't know, maybe a very good reason for doing this. All right. But if you look at what's in here, what do we have? Well, it's the home controller. It inherits from controller. It needs the Microsoft.ASP.NET Core.MVC. It needs that using statement because in here is where all of these methods are defined. You'll notice there's two iAction results in here, one for index and one for about. All right. With the index, it's going to come back as it says, and it's just going to return the text home controller index action. And if you leave that out of there, that's as though you put in index. Then when they did it and they put home about, it's got home controller about action as shown right there. All right. I don't think we have to go over anything in this description part because it's what we just talked about. And again, if as you're going through this, you have questions, it is your responsibility to get a hold of me and let me know. All right, how to code a controller that uses an ID segment. So the next example, this figure 6.4, shows a product controller that is going to put in probably like a product ID or something like that. It says the controller begins much like the home controller, but both of the action methods provide a method named ID. All right. The list, as it says, uses the string type for an ID and it provides a default value of all. So if you don't put anything in there, if you don't specify any ID, it'll show you all products. And it's using a string type for the ID, so it can default to the string all. On the other hand, as it says right there, the default uses an int return type and does not provide a default value. Where this was list, you could have even called it details with an S on the end. This is singular detail. So it's providing the information about a single product. What product? The one you put in here and you identify with your ID parameter. All right. Now it says here, if the URL specifies a value for an ID segment that is not numeric, it can't do the conversion. So it sets it equal to 0. In other words, as they mentioned there, it treats it as though you didn't provide a value at all. All right. Just so the program doesn't blow up right there. All right. And they're showing it right here. So again, these are two different methods. This is a list that asks for a string for the ID. It defaults to all. This is a single product, so it's got an int ID. If you don't put anything in, it'll be a 0. So they show some examples here. All right, product list, and they got here ID like 411. They're assuming there's only one product, I guess. And here is detail, and it's product with an ID of 3. All right. How to create custom routes. Says now that you understand how the default route works, you're ready to learn how to create custom routes. One way to do that is to add static content to a route. So that's what they'll talk about first. Notice all of the segments in the route pattern are dynamic. In other words, they specify content that can change with each URL. All right, and think about this. With what we just looked at with product, if you've got 5 products and you're supposed to put an ID in there every time, an int ID, that's 5 different examples you'd have. You had 500 products, etc. All right. To make a URL easier to read, you may want to include static content as part of a segment. Something like, and they give the example in here, if you wanted to put the word page in there so you knew what page you were on of output as an example. So to do that, as they mention here, you can use a string literal. So the 4th segment in their pattern includes the string literal of the word page before a number in there. So like it said, it'll have something like page 4 if you pass 4 in as the number. All right. In the pattern for the first example, as it says, none of the segments are optional. None of them provide default values. So you must specify everything. And it says if you specify all 4 segments, the action method that's matched to the request URL can use its parameters to get data from the 3rd and 4th segments. If you don't want to mix static and dynamic like they did with page and then the page number, it says you can achieve a similar result by coding a routing pattern that specifies a completely static segment followed by a completely dynamic segment. And that's the last example that they will show in here. So you should be able to tell now product controller, list method, but it's the list. And it's, again, what's, as far as what's in here, it's got that dynamic or that content in there with the word page followed by the page number. It's the product page 2 of the product. If indeed, like they say here at the top of the page right now, you can also take the word page out that's in there and put it in there as a completely static segment. And it pretty much works the same way. The only difference is here it was page 1 and page 2. Here it's page /1 and page /2. Which is better? I can't really tell you. I guess in some ways, at least, it's a matter of opinion. All right. How to work then with multiple routing patterns. When you create routes, custom routes, as it says, it's common to use them in addition to the default route and other custom routes. When you map multiple routing patterns, you must code the most specific pattern first and the most general pattern last. That's why, again, when I had it up there first, it was doing the home thing instead of going right to our conversion or converter model. So as they mentioned here, the example in figure 6.6 shows how this works. It says to start, the first routing path is most specific because it specifies everything. All right. As a result, as it says, the URL only matches this pattern if it includes all 5 segments. The second example, like the first, except it doesn't specify a 5th segment for sorting. So it does paging, but not a thing in there for sorting. The next pattern is the least specific because it specifies the 3rd segment as being optional and gives default values for the first 2 segments. The list method, as it says here, shown in this figure, shows how you can access the arguments in the URL segments. The first parameter, as they mentioned, is named ID. The second is page. The third is sort by. And they give you examples of how to use each one of these. If this does not make sense, please, please, please take the time to run through the examples. Again, in here, everything is required. In here, everything is required, but rather than having 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 segments, we only have 1, 2, 3, 4 segments. This is the most liberal now at the top. All right. Because it's the default one. So there's examples in the chart here, in all these charts at the bottom of the page. And my hope is that you looking at them, that they will make sense to you. And if they don't, you'll ask in class. All right. Okay. When you map multiple routing patterns, you must code the most specific ones first, the most general ones last. Already mentioned that. All right. So the next thing in here talks about attribute routing. As it says, so far in this chapter, they've shown you how to use the program.cs file to specify the routing patterns for an app, but you can override this routing by decorating the action methods. Remember, decorating is like when we put required or we put a range attribute in our model fields. But as they're saying here, you can override the routing by decorating the action methods themselves of a controller with route attributes. As it says, this is known as attribute routing. All right, so figure 6.7 is mentioned right there, starts by showing the class for the home controller after attribute routing has been applied to the index and the about actions. Let's look. All right, so this says by default, the route is going to be basically, here the route will, so this will go to home index and this will go to home about. It's exactly what they're saying in here. As far as changing the routing for an action, all right, it says the figure on the next page starts by showing the class for the home controller after the attribute routing has been applied to the index and about actions. To change the routing, as it says, this code decorates it with a route attribute. It places the route attribute directly above the index method, supplying the route of slash. As mentioned, this maps the index action to a URL that requests the root folder of the app. All right. As they mentioned, these route attributes specify static routes, not actual patterns. In addition, they override any custom routing patterns that are specified by the program.cs file. As a result, if you add these attributes, home index out. So to access here the home index, you must put in a slash. The home about must be slash about. As they mentioned, since it leads to shorter URLs, typically that only is not a problem. It's probably what you want. When you specify a static URL like about, route doesn't change if you change the name of the about action later. So if you need to do that, as it says, you can use the action token in the route attribute instead of hard coding the name in. Right? The controller token, as mentioned right there, works much like the action token. All right, you'll see this in the coming pages. With ASP.NET Core 3.0 and later, attribute routing is typically enabled by default, so you typically don't need to add any code to program.cs to enable it. So here are the decorations there in mustard. So again, to use this, now to get to the index, you wouldn't say home, you would just say slash. You wouldn't say home about, you just say about. So you are overriding these two methods right here. Right. So the next figure is mentioned right there, begins by showing the class for the product controller after attribute routing has been applied. To do that, as it says, these methods are decorated with the route attribute right there. Now we're being even more specific. All right. So we're telling it the controller to go to, and in this case, the fact that it's got an optional ID that can be passed to it. So as it says, for the detail action, the route attribute specifies a URL where the first segment is product, The second is a required argument named ID. So a slash product won't map to that action because there's no ID passed to it. Rather, it'll map to product index action. As they mentioned there in the last two examples, show that you can make attribute routing more flexible by using the controller token. As they mentioned there, as you review the figure, note that you can use many of the same things we've used in the past, such as the question mark for something being optional. And here are some examples. You'll notice in this case, the ID is optional, and in this case, it's mandatory. There's also a non-action in here. As they mentioned, if a controller contains methods that are not action methods, you can decorate them with non-action to prevent them from being mapped to a URL. That's right here. All right. How to change the routing for a controller. As mentioned here on the top of the page, in the last two figures, you learned how to use the attribute routing to override the routing for a single action in the controller. However, it's also possible to use attribute routing to override the routing for all actions within a controller. To do that, you can decorate the declaration for the class with the route attribute as shown in figure 6.9, right here. So even though this is in the product controller, we're telling it to go to the retail controller to get what it needs. And that's kind of what they're saying here. As mentioned, here the route attribute decorates the class declaration with 4 segments. The first is the static retail. The second is the name of the controller. The third is the name of the action, and the fourth is the name of the ID. As with actions, the attribute routing for a controller overrides the default routing. Very similar to what we looked at earlier. Now they're just going to give you a page or two of some best practices. So in other words, as far as standards go, these are probably as close as what you're going to get. So as mentioned here, just to start with, first, as it says, well-designed URLs can improve the usability of your app for both developers and end users. All right, you want to make it as easy for someone to use your program as possible. Second, well-designed URLs can improve SEO, search engine optimization for your app. All right. So they mention here, it says the first 3 examples show 3 ways to identify a product. The first shows a number, 1307. The second shows a slug, which is the descriptive string. All right. And as mentioned there, using a slug is more user-friendly, but it usually makes database queries less efficient. Many times when you do this kind of stuff, whether you choose A or B, there may be a trade-off. All right. Something might take longer. Something might require a little more typing, etc. The last 3 examples, as it says, compare bad practices to best practices. So if we take a look quickly at what's in there. First, they give you a little checklist. And as it says here, best practices for URLs, keep them as short as possible, but still make them descriptive and user-friendly. Use keywords to describe page content, not implementation details, because those can change. Make your URLs easy for humans to understand and type. Use hyphens to separate words, not other characters, especially not spaces. Prefer names as identifiers over numbers. Create an intuitive hierarchy. Be consistent. And avoid the use of query string parameters when you can. All right, and all this stuff down here is what we just set up above. Using hyphens to separate words is also known as kebab case, because it's supposed to look like something on a skewer. I never got it, but that's what they say. All right, the last part of the chapter, I think it's the last part at least, is going to talk about areas. Now, just so you know, and this is my take on it, an area, when you start creating areas in a program, it's kind of like when you are working on a project and you decide to develop an outline. All right. Because what you're doing with areas is you're splitting a program up into different chunks. And each chunk can have its own controllers, its own models, its own views. They can share models, etc. But as it says, this can help organize the folders and files in the app. All right. And it's not hard to set it up. By convention, as it says, you create an area by adding a folder named areas to the root of your app. Then within the areas folder, you can add a folder for that area. All right. So they made an admin one in here, and that's a pretty popular one to make and put in as an area. All right. Within the folders for the area, you can add any necessary subfolders, your own controllers, your own models, your own views, and other things too, whatever you'd need. Since this area is separate from the main area, it can use the same name for the controller files and the view files. To get views for the admin area to work correctly, it includes an underscore admin layout that's shared by all views. So instead of saying basically you're using layout, you tell it that you're using admin layout. All right. Once you've set up the folders and files for an area, you must configure the routes so they include the area, and they will show an example of that, I believe, in here as well. So you'll notice we're starting to come in here and notice under areas. So this, everything that's in here is an area. This is the stuff we've had so far. But as we start to segment, segregate, or whatever you want to say with our programs, we're going to do more and more of this, or at least it's possible to do it if we want. And you'll notice how the route changes. You have to preface it with admin, all right, because it's in a different, in this case, area. So as mentioned on the bottom of page 225 here, an ASP.NET Core MVC app can have multiple areas where each area can have its own controllers, models, and views, done typically for organizational means or reasons. To configure the route for an area, you use the map area controller route method. Okay. All right, so let's see. Just about finished here. So it says here how to associate controllers with areas. Before you can use a controller with an area, you must use the area attribute to associate it with an area. To do that, you can decorate the controller with the area attribute that will be shown on the next page. The value specified here must match the area name. So we won't be able to probably use any names we've been putting in. Okay. All right. After you add the area attribute to a controller, as it says, you can use the area token along with it, and you'll see the examples that are here, right there. So there are some examples that are given here down towards the bottom half of page 227. You'll notice they're all prefaced with /admin. All right, so before you can use a controller with an area, you must use the area attribute to associate with an area. After you add the area attribute, you can use the area token to specify routing for the actions of the controller. And I believe that's it for the chapter. Now, that was very quick. What I'd like to do, maybe in the next class, I don't know yet, but this week, is I'd like to go over exercise 6.1, practice routing. And there's steps in there. It looks like there's 22 steps, but I think it'll be in our best interest to do that before we go on into chapter 7. So for the last time then, okay, we have now today in a private video, I built project 6.1 the quote right way. All right, so this I'm sorry, we redid hot 1. So that was the distance converter, and cranks t-shirt. This one I did for you. I'd like you to replicate that one yourselves. This one I want you to do on your own. And we finished lecturing on chapter 6. So tomorrow, the first thing I'll do, I'll put a 0 in here, and that is go over end of chapter for chapter 6. Then we'll look at project 6.1 and 6.2. Talk a little bit about the case study. We will not start tomorrow until 1:30. Wednesday, I'm going to write hot 2 for you as a class because some people I think are still having a little bit of trouble with it. If there's time, we'll go into chapter 7, do as much of that as we can. Hopefully finish that up on Thursday. Look at project 7.1, and this is the first one. Really, you'll be assigned to do some work in there. Friday will be a lab. That's all I've got. So I will talk to you tomorrow. Please have a good rest of the day, and I will see you then. 1:30 p.m. tomorrow.